Today marks 25 years since the South African Constitution took effect. It was signed into law on the 10th of December 1996 and took effect the following year on the 4th of February 1997. Joining us to reflect on the milestone tonight is legal expert Benedict Phiri, a regular face here on Newzroom Afrika. Benedict, always good to see you. Good evening on this Friday. So 25 years on, is this still a constitution that serves all South Africans across the racial and socio-economic spectrum?
I think the Constitution is very much alive. I think we have the benefit of seeing a number of court cases at the Constitutional Court and a number of other courts where, you know, there's a number of those where we seek to extend and interpret and give life to all these rights that we have been granted and bequeathed by the Constitution. I do think that in some areas it hasn't reached enough. Poverty is still very pervasive in this country. Inequality is pervasive. Racial discrimination is pervasive. And the Constitution was meant to bridge all of that and transition us from apartheid to a new future. And I think it hasn't done enough. But having said that, we've seen the Constitutional Court come out very strongly where Parliament, for instance, or Cabinet has not been doing their job and really holding up what it means to be a constitutional democracy and a culture of proper governance and a rational justification for government decisions.
You mentioned poverty, racial discrimination in this country, just some of the things that the Constitution had at its adoption and its drafting sought to address. But in order for some of those things to be addressed fully, the Constitution would have had to take effect via policies enacted by government. Is that where the failing is?
I think partly, yes, absolutely. I think, you know, we've seen enough matters in this country go through the Constitutional Court where, you know, government has been told to do something to give effect to constitutional rights or has been lambasted for not giving effect to constitutional rights. And I think there is a problem with the legislative arm of government and also, to a lesser extent, the executive arm of government, which I think the Constitutional Court has done well to fill. But having said that, I think there is probably also an educational component of not enough South Africans knowing what their rights are under the Constitution and knowing what the Constitution can actually provide them with. So I don't believe that we have enough test cases on some of the key areas that the Constitution is meant to deliver. And I can only hope that in the next 25 years, we can test and probe some of those areas in more depth.
And do you think the last, shall we say, decade to half a decade, or half a decade to a decade has in fact been the biggest test, especially as far as the separation of powers doctrine, right? The judiciary and the executive, where the Constitutional Court has had to say we can only rule on issues, but for example, they cannot instruct Parliament on what to do.
Absolutely. I think under the Zuma years, you know, there was real spotlight on the rule of law. We've had, you know, impeachment cases, for instance, which had never come through the Constitutional Court. We've had cases that have tested the separation of powers around what the courts and how far can the courts actually weigh on policy questions. So definitely the last 10 to 15 years, in my view, has seen what we term in the legal profession as lawfare. You know, this has been a situation where politics and government and governance has been highly contested, and often we've resorted to the Constitutional Court to sort that out. And, you know, I think the good thing is that the Constitution has stood test and has stood strong against that. But there is then this question of the narrative that we're hearing from the politicians saying the judges are going too far, which is, you know, chipping away at the legitimacy of the courts and the authority of the courts. So I think, you know, I'd love to see over the next 25 years a little bit more of the socioeconomic rights, you know, some of the promises really from the shape and feel and look of this country that this Constitution had promised, and start to seeing those come into play. Education, access to water, access to land. I think that we'd like to see a lot more of the courts weighing into that space than currently this last 10 or 15 years of lawfare.
And just on that point, you mentioned access to water, basic services that were promised in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and it's gotten a while, right, to see these precedents setting legal battles, shall we call them, between politicians, business and industry. But if the people who are not the middle class, poor South Africans, still don't have access to those services in their own language, in their community, it cannot be a fair system.
That's correct, and I think that has really been the shortcoming. And you can just contrast the first, 5 to 8 years of the Constitution. We had exceptional judgments. We had treatment action campaign and antiretroviral access. We had, state liability, the Carmichael case. We had land tenure with respect to contract laborers on the farms. We've had prevention of illegal eviction. We had amazing judgments that are really going to the social fabric of this country. But I think we have sort of just missed the focus a little bit, with these politicians fighting out their battles in the courts. And I really hope that government can really take responsibility for some of those issues and locate them within Parliament or within the political parties or within the executive and deal with them appropriately as political issues and not so much as legal issues within the courts.
And how then in the next 25 years do we get the best out of our Constitution across the three spheres, the judiciary, the executive and the legislature? Do we need to craft new additions or simply actually apply what already exists?
I think we absolutely need to apply what already exists. We have a visionary and extensive Constitution. I certainly believe it's one of the best in the world, if not the best in the world. There's still scope for interpretation on a number of provisions in the Constitution. We haven't seen enough cases come through. And I think once we start having lawyers and the public testing these provisions, we'll build up, a good history of jurisprudence that will serve us well going forward.
Benedict Phiri, always great to speak to you. Thank you for your time. Enjoy the rest of your Friday evening.